The small town of had always been a quiet place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of town where gossip traveled faster than the morning newspaper, and where people formed opinions about their neighbors that lasted for generations. In this town, there lived a woman named Ellen, though most people simply called her. She was 47 years old, lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of town, and worked as a cleaning lady at the local community center. Was not what anyone would call remarkable at first glance. She was a heavy-set woman with graying hair that she always kept in a simple bun. Her clothes were never fashionable, always practical cotton dresses and worn cardigans that had seen better days. She walked with her head slightly bowed, as if she was always apologizing for taking up space in the world. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and she rarely spoke unless someone spoke to her first. The people of had long ago decided what kind of person was. She was the invisible woman, the one who cleaned up after their events and mopped their floors. Children would sometimes make fun of her shuffling walk. Teenagers would whisper and laugh when she passed by. Adults would look through her as if she wasn't even there. This had been life for as long as anyone could remember. But what the people of didn't know was that had a secret. Every night, when she returned to her small cottage, she would close all the curtains, put on old vinyl records, and sing. She would sing for hours, her voice filling the tiny rooms with sounds that seemed too beautiful to belong to the woman everyone thought they knew. She had been singing since she was a little girl, taught by her grandmother who had once performed in grand theaters across Europe before immigrating to America. His grandmother had told her that she had a gift, a voice that could touch people's souls. But life had not been kind, too. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 16, and she had been forced to drop out of school to work and support herself. Her dreams of studying music, of performing on stages, had faded like old photographs left in the sun. She had accepted her fate as the invisible woman of, finding her only joy in those secret nightly concerts in her living room. The town of had a tradition that went back over 50 years. Every spring, they held a talent show at the community center to celebrate the arrival of warmer weather. It was a beloved event that brought the whole town together. People would perform songs, dances, magic tricks, and comedy routines. Winners would receive a small trophy and bragging rights for the entire year. The show was taken very seriously, and people would practice for months to prepare their acts. One cold February morning, something happened that would change everything. Was mopping the floors of the community center when she noticed a colorful poster on the bulletin board. It announced this year's talent show and encouraged everyone in town to participate. Below the poster was a sign-up sheet with blank lines waiting to be filled. Stood there for a long time, mop in hand, staring at that poster. Something stirred inside her, a feeling she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it existed. For the first time in decades, thought about performing. She thought about standing on that stage and sharing the gift her grandmother had given her. The thought was terrifying and exciting at the same time. She told herself it was a foolish idea. What would people think? They would laugh at her. They would mock her even more than they already did. She was just the cleaning lady. Nobody wanted to hear her sing. But that night, as sang alone in her cottage, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to do something more. She looked at the old photographs of her grandmother on the wall, dressed in beautiful gowns, standing on grand stages. Her grandmother had always told her that fear was just a door that needed to be opened. For years, had kept that door firmly shut. But now, something was pushing her to finally turn the handle. The next morning arrived at the community center an hour early. The building was empty and quiet. She walked slowly to the bulletin board, her heart pounding in her chest. The sign-up sheet was still there, now with several names written on it. She recognized them all, the usual performers who participated every year. There was Tom Bradley, who always did magic tricks. There was the Henderson family with their country music band. There was young Sarah, who had won last year with her ballet performance. His hand trembled as she picked up the pen attached to the clipboard. She stood there for what felt like hours, the pen hovering over the paper. Every voice in her head told her to put the pen down and walk away. Every memory of being laughed at, being ignored, being made to feel worthless, screamed at her to stop. But somewhere deeper, she heard another voice. It was her grandmother's voice, telling her that she was born to sing, that her voice was a gift meant to be shared with the world. With a shaking hand, wrote her name on the sign-up sheet. Ellen. She put down the pen and stepped back, looking at what she had done. Her name looked so out of place among the others, like a dandelion growing in a rose garden. She wanted to erase it, to pretend it had never happened. But instead, she took a deep breath and walked away. Word spread quickly through. By lunchtime, everyone in town knew that the cleaning lady had signed up for the talent show. The reactions were exactly what had feared. At the grocery store, she heard two women laughing about it in the next aisle. At the post office, she noticed people whispering and pointing at her. Children on the street made jokes about what she would do on stage. Would she mop? Would she scrub floors to music? The mockery was endless and cruel. Someone had even made a cartoon drawing of on stage with a mop and bucket, and it was passed around town like a hilarious joke. People placed bets on how long she would last before running off stage in embarrassment. The general opinion was that had finally lost her mind, and that the talent show would be the most entertaining disaster had ever seen. Heard every laugh, every whisper, every cruel joke. Each one felt like a knife cutting into her heart. There were moments when she wanted to take her name off the list and disappear back into her invisible life. But every night when she sang alone in her cottage, she remembered why she had signed up in the first place. She remembered her grandmother's words. She remembered the dreams she had buried so long ago. And she decided that no matter what happened, she would not give up. The weeks leading up to the talent show were the most difficult of life. She continued her work at the community center, mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms while people who passed by smirked at her or made snide comments. Some were bold enough to ask her directly what she planned to do on stage. When she quietly answered that she would sing, the laughter that followed was loud and merciless. One afternoon, while was cleaning the main hall where the talent show would take place, a group of teenagers gathered near the stage. They didn't seem to notice her, or perhaps they simply didn't care that she could hear them. One of them, a boy with a cruel smile, jumped onto the stage and began imitating what he imagines performance would look like. He hunched his back, shuffled his feet, and made exaggerated operatic sounds that were meant to sound ridiculous. His friends howled with laughter, clutching their stomachs and wiping tears from their eyes. Stood frozen, her mop gripped tightly in her hands. She wanted to run, to hide, to pretend she hadn't heard, but her feet wouldn't move. She was forced to stand there and listen as they mocked her, as they reduced her dreams to a joke. When they finally noticed her standing in the corner, they fell silent for only a moment before bursting into even louder laughter. They walked past her, still giggling, not bothering to apologize. That night didn't sing. She sat in her living room in complete darkness, staring at nothing. The cruelty of those teenagers had broken something inside her. She questioned everything. Why had she signed up for the talent show? What had made her think she could ever be anything more than a cleaning lady? Her grandmother had been wrong about her. She had no gift. She was nobody. The next morning, woke up with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. She had made her decision during her sleepless night. She would go to the community center and remove her name from the sign-up sheet. She would return to her invisible life and never think about performing again. It was the only sensible thing to do. But as she was getting ready to leave, there was a knock at her door. This was unusual, as almost never had visitors. She opened the door to find an old woman standing on her porch. It was Williams, a 92-year-old woman who lived at the retirement home on the other side of town. Was a legend in. She had been a professional singer in her youth, performing in jazz clubs and theaters across the country. Age had taken away her ability to sing, but it had not diminished the fire in her eyes. Had heard about signing up for the talent show. She had also heard about how the town was treating her. Without waiting to be invited, walked into his cottage and sat down on the worn sofa. She looked around the room, taking in the old record player, the vinyl records stacked neatly on shelves, and the photographs of his grandmother on the walls. For a long moment said nothing. Then she turned to and asked her to sing, was startled. No one had ever asked her to sing before. She tried to refuse, saying she wasn't any good, that she was just a foolish old woman with foolish dreams, but would not take no for an answer. She sat there with her arms crossed, waiting patiently. Finally took a deep breath and began to sing. She chose an old song, one that her grandmother had taught her decades ago. It was a song about love and loss, about holding on to hope even when everything seemed dark. As she sang, her voice filled the small cottage with a sound so pure and powerful that it seemed to make the walls tremble. Years of pain, loneliness, and hidden dreams poured out of her in every note. When finished, she looked at nervously, expecting criticism or perhaps polite silence, but had tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She took hands in her own and told her something that changed everything. She told that in all her 92 years, in all the clubs and theaters she had performed in and visited, she had never heard a voice like's. It was the kind of voice that came along once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime. Couldn't believe what she was hearing. She tried to argue, to explain all the reasons why must be wrong, but wouldn't listen. Instead, she made a promise. She would help her prepare for the talent show. She would teach her everything she knew about performing, about commanding a stage, about touching people's hearts with music. In return, had to promise one thing. She had to promise not to give up. From that day forward came to cottage every afternoon. They would work for hours, going over songs, practicing breathing techniques, and discussing the art of performance. Was a demanding teacher. She pushed harder than anyone had ever pushed her before. There were moments when wanted to quit, when she felt she couldn't meet high standards, but always knew exactly what to say to keep her going. As the weeks passed, something began to change in. She started walking with her head a little higher. Her voice, already beautiful, became even more powerful and controlled. She began to believe, for the first time in her life, that maybe she did have something special. Maybe her grandmother had been right all along. But the town's mockery didn't stop. If anything, it grew worse as the talent show approached. Someone started a running joke about selling tickets specifically to see Embarrass herself. Local businesses began putting up humorous signs referencing her upcoming performance. The cartoon of With the Mop was printed on t-shirts that some people actually wore around town. Saw all of this and it hurt her deeply. But she had made a promise to, and she intended to keep it. Every cruel joke, every mocking laugh only made her more determined. She would show them. She would show all of them who she really was. The night before the talent show, came to cottage for one final practice session. They went through the song had chosen to perform, a beautiful aria that had been her grandmother's signature piece. It was a difficult song, demanding both technical skill and emotional depth, but sang it perfectly, her voice soaring through the cottage like something not quite of this world. When she finished, embraced her tightly. She told that she was ready, that tomorrow night she would show the world what true talent looked like. Then gave a gift. It was a small velvet box containing a beautiful silver brooch in the shape of a songbird. Explained that it had been given to her by a famous musician decades ago, and that she had worn it for every performance of her career. Now she wanted to have it. Held the brooch in her trembling hands, overcome with emotion. She tried to refuse such a precious gift, but insisted. She said that the brooch belonged on a stage, and that would give it the home it deserved. They hugged once more and then left into the night. Didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, the brooch clutched in her hands, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. She thought about her grandmother who had first recognized her gift. She thought about who had believed in her when no one else did. And she thought about all the people who had laughed at her, who had made her feel worthless and invisible. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the town would discover who really was. The morning of the talent show arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, was buzzing with excitement. The annual spring talent show was always the highlight of the social calendar, but this year there was an added element that had everyone talking. Everyone wanted to see what the cleaning lady would do on stage. Many people who had never attended the talent show before had requested tickets just for the entertainment they expected to provide. The community center was decorated with colorful banners and fresh flowers. Rows of chairs had been set up to accommodate the unusually large crowd expected that evening. Backstage, performers were arriving with their costumes and props, running through last-minute rehearsals and trying to calm their nerves. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Spent the day alone in her cottage trying to keep herself calm. She had laid out her outfit on the bed the night before. It was a simple dark blue dress that she had owned for years but had never had an occasion to wear. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was the nicest thing she owned. Beside it lay silver songbird brooch, gleaming in the afternoon light. As the hours passed, found herself talking to her grandmother's photograph on the wall. She told her about the talent show, about everything that had happened. She asked for strength and courage. She asked for her grandmother to be with her on that stage. Whether it was her imagination or something more, felt a warm presence in the room, as if her grandmother was answering her prayers. At 5 o'clock began getting ready. She took a long bath, styled her gray hair into something more elegant than her usual bun, and put on the blue dress. She pinned brooch near her heart. Looking at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. For the first time in years, she saw something other than the invisible cleaning lady. She saw someone who might just have something to offer the world. The walk to the community center felt like the longest journey of life. With every step, her heart pounded harder. She passed neighbors who did double takes, surprised to see her dressed up and walking with purpose. Some of them snickered, assuming this was just the beginning of the evening's comedy. Others looked confused, as if they couldn't quite reconcile this version of with the woman they thought they knew. When arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already full. People were streaming through the front doors, chattering excitedly about the performances they expected to see. Went around to the back entrance, the one she used every day when she came to clean. Tonight, however, she wasn't there to clean. Tonight, she was a performer. The backstage area was crowded with contestants and their families. Tom Bradley was practicing card tricks in the corner. The Henderson family was tuning their instruments. Young Sarah was stretching in preparation for her dance routine. When entered, the noise level dropped noticeably. People turned to look at her, surprised to see the cleaning lady in a dress instead of her work clothes. Some tried to hide their smirks, while others openly laughed. Found a quiet corner away from the others and sat down to wait. The show would begin in an hour, and she was scheduled to perform near the end. This had not been her choice. The organizers had placed her last because they assumed her act would be the comic finale of the evening. Little did they know. As she waited, watched the other performers prepare. She saw the confidence in their movements, the support of their families and friends. She had none of that. She was alone, just as she had always been alone. But strangely, she didn't feel lonely anymore. She thought of who had promised to be in the audience tonight. She thought of her grandmother, who she believed was watching from somewhere beyond. She had people in her corner after all. The sound of the audience growing louder drifted backstage. People were taking their seats, the noise of conversation and laughter filling the hall. Could hear individual voices she recognized, people she had cleaned up after for years. She wondered what they would think when she stepped onto that stage. Would they finally see her as something more than invisible? At 7 o'clock sharp, the talent show began. Mayor James Wilson walked onto the stage to thunderous applause and delivered a welcoming speech about community, tradition, and the joy of celebrating local talent. He made a few jokes about this year's lineup that drew knowing laughter from the audience. Knew he was referring to her. The first performer was Tom Bradley with his magic show. He pulled rabbits from hats, made cards disappear, and even escaped from a locked box. The audience clapped enthusiastically. Next came a stand-up comedian who told jokes about life in a small town. Then a group of elementary school children performed a dance they had been practicing for months. One by one, the acts went on, each receiving its share of applause. Backstage, watched on a small monitor that showed the stage. With each passing performance, her turn drew closer. She found herself breathing deeply, using the techniques had taught her. She visualized herself on stage, heard herself singing, imagined the audience actually listening instead of laughing. Had told her that visualization was one of the most powerful tools a performer could have. The Henderson family took the stage with their country music set, playing guitars and fiddles and singing harmonies that made the audience clap along. They were good, thought. Everyone was good. What made her think she could compete with these polished performers? Doubt began creeping into her mind again, wrapping around her confidence like a choking vine. But then she thought of words. She thought of her grandmother's faith in her. She touched the silver brooch pinned to her dress and felt strength flowing into her. She had come too far to give up now. She had endured too much mockery, shed too many tears, faced too many fears. If she walked away tonight, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Young Sarah was the second to last performer. She danced beautifully, her movements graceful and precise. The audience gave her a standing ovation. She was clearly the favorite to win again this year. As she came off stage, flushed with success, she gave a look that was a mixture of pity and amusement. Then the moment arrived. The announcer's voice came over the speakers, introducing the final act of the evening. He said its name, and a ripple of laughter went through the audience. This was what they had been waiting for. This was the moment they expected to provide entertainment of a different kind. Stood up from her chair. Her legs felt weak and her hands were trembling. The walk from backstage to the stage seemed impossibly long. She could hear the audience's laughter growing louder as she approached. Every step was a battle against the urge to turn and run. But she kept moving forward. She had made a promise to. She had a grandmother to honor. She had a lifetime of invisibility to overcome. The stage lights were blinding as stepped into view. For a moment she couldn't see anything except whiteness. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw the audience before her. Hundreds of faces, most of them twisted into expressions of amusement or anticipation of failure. In the front row, she spotted, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, a serene smile on her face. Their eyes met and gave her a small nod of encouragement. Walked to the center of the stage. The laughter was dying down now, replaced by an expectant silence. People shifted in their seats, getting comfortable for what they assumed would be an embarrassing spectacle. Someone in the back called out a mocking comment that drew scattered chuckles. Heard it all, but she didn't let it penetrate her focus. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought of her grandmother's cottage, of the music that had filled her childhood. She thought of all the nights she had sung alone in her living room, pouring her heart into songs that no one else could hear. Now, finally, the world would hear what she had been hiding all these years. The piano accompaniment began, filling the hall with the opening notes of her grandmother's favorite aria. Opened her mouth and began to sing. The first note that left lips silenced the entire room. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the world. The scattered laughter, the whispered comments, the rustling of programs stopped instantly. People who had been reaching for their phones to record what they expected to be a disaster froze with their hands in midair. The sound that came from this ordinary-looking woman was anything but ordinary. Its voice filled the community center with a richness and depth that seemed impossible. It soared into the highest corners of the room and wrapped around every person present like a warm embrace. The aria she had chosen was about lost love and the hope of reunion, sung in Italian with an emotion that transcended language. Even those who didn't understand a single word could feel exactly what the song meant. In the audience, jaws dropped and eyes widened. The smirks that had been plastered on so many faces melted away, replaced by expressions of shock and disbelief. This couldn't be the same woman they had mocked. This couldn't be the cleaning lady they had looked through for years. And yet, there she stood, her eyes still closed, completely lost in the music, her voice reaching places in people's hearts they had forgotten existed. Mayor Wilson sat in the front row, his prepared speech about graciously accepting all levels of talent crumpling in his hands. He had expected to smooth things over after what he assumed would be an embarrassing performance. Now he sat speechless, tears forming in his eyes without him even realizing it. Beside him, his wife clutched his arm, overwhelmed by what she was witnessing. The teenagers who had mocked at the community center weeks earlier were scattered throughout the audience. The boy who had jumped on stage to imitate her sat frozen in his seat, his face burning with shame. The laughter that had seemed so funny before now felt like a crime. How could they have been so cruel to someone capable of creating such beauty? Sang on, unaware of the transformation happening in the room before her. With her eyes closed, she was back in her grandmother's cottage, a little girl learning songs that seemed too big for her young voice. She was in her own living room, singing alone night after night, dreaming of a moment exactly like this one. Every pain she had ever felt, every rejection, every moment of being invisible, poured out through her voice and became something transcendent. The song built to its emotional peak, its voice climbing higher and higher until it seemed to touch something divine. The notes hung in the air like crystals, perfectly formed and impossibly pure. Then, gradually, she brought it back down, the melody softening into a tender conclusion that left everyone breathless. The final note faded into silence, a silence so complete that you could have heard a pin drop in that crowded room. For a moment nothing happened. Stood on stage, her eyes still closed, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. She was afraid to open her eyes, afraid to see the laughter she expected. But there was no laughter. There was only silence, heavy and strange. Then from somewhere in the audience, someone began to clap. It was, rising to her feet in the front row, her wrinkled hands coming together in steady applause. Within seconds, others joined her. One by one, people stood up from their seats, clapping with growing intensity. The applause spread through the room like a wave, building into a thunderous ovation that shook the walls of the community center. Opened her eyes to see something she had never imagined. The entire town was on its feet, applauding for her. The people who had laughed at her, who had made cruel jokes about her, who had treated her as invisible for decades, were now crying and cheering, and showing her a respect she had never known. The transformation was complete and instantaneous. In the span of one song, had gone from laughingstock to legend. Tears streamed down her face as she stood there, overwhelmed by the response. She had hoped at best for polite applause. She had feared, at worst, laughter and humiliation. But this outpouring of genuine emotion and admiration, was beyond anything she had dared to dream. For the first time in her 47 years, she felt truly seen. The applause continued for several minutes. People stamped their feet and called out for more. Some shouted apologies, their voices breaking with emotion. Others simply stood there crying, moved beyond words by what they had witnessed. The community center had hosted many talent shows over the years, but nothing like this had ever happened before. Mayor Wilson finally made his way to the stage, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. He took the microphone and tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He had to pause and compose himself before he could continue. When he finally did speak, he said that in all his years as mayor, in all the events and ceremonies he had presided over, he had never witnessed anything as beautiful as what had just given them. He announced that the judges didn't need to deliberate. The decision was unanimous and immediate. Was the winner of the Spring Talent Show by a landslide. But more than that, he said, she had reminded the entire town what it meant to have courage, to follow your dreams, and to never let others define who you are. Accepted the small trophy with trembling hands. It was just a cheap plastic thing, worth almost nothing in monetary value. But to her, it was priceless. It was proof that her grandmother had been right. It was validation of every night she had spent singing alone, keeping her gift alive even when no one cared to hear it. It was justice for every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every moment of invisibility she had endured. As she clutched the trophy to her chest, looked out at the audience and saw something remarkable. People who had never given her a second glance were looking at her with new eyes. She saw shame in some faces, guilt in others. But most of all, she saw wonder. They were seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time in their lives. After the show, was surrounded by people wanting to talk to her, to shake her hand, to apologize for how they had treated her. Mrs. from the grocery store, who had often looked at with thinly veiled disdain, now held her hands and cried, telling her she had the voice of an angel. Tom Bradley, who had won the talent show 3 years in a row before tonight, graciously congratulated her and admitted that he had never heard anything so moving. The teenagers who had mocked her were there too. They hung back at first, too ashamed to approach. But finally the boy who had imitated her on stage stepped forward. His eyes were red and his voice was shaky as he apologized. He said he didn't know, couldn't have imagined what she was capable of. He begged her forgiveness for his cruelty, looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and told him that she forgave him. Holding onto anger, she said, was like carrying a heavy stone. She had carried enough weight in her life. Made her way through the crowd to embrace. No words were needed between them. Everything had believed, everything she had taught had been proven true on that stage. The songbird brooch gleamed on his dress, finally in the spotlight where it belonged. The local newspaper reporter pushed through to get a statement. She asked how she felt, where she had learned to sing, why she had kept her talent hidden for so long. Answered as best she could, though she was still in a daze. She explained about her grandmother, about the years of singing alone, about encouragement. The reporter scribbled furiously, knowing this story was bigger than anything she had covered before. That night, as walked home under a sky full of stars, she felt like a different person. The trophy was in her hands, his brooch was over her heart, and for the first time in decades, she walked with her head held high. The town that had ignored her for so long would never see her the same way again. But more importantly, she would never see herself the same way again. The invisible woman was invisible no more. The morning after the talent show, woke up wondering if it had all been a dream. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night in her mind. The applause, the tears, the overwhelming response, it all seemed too incredible to be real. Then she saw the trophy sitting on her nightstand, catching the morning light, and she knew it had actually happened. Her phone, an old flip phone she rarely used, had been ringing since dawn. She didn't recognize most of the numbers. Messages had been left by people she barely knew, all wanting to talk to her, to congratulate her, to tell her how moved they had been by her performance. The world had shifted overnight and was still trying to find her footing in this new reality. She got out of bed slowly, her body aching from the emotional intensity of the previous night. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the town come to life. Children walked to school, neighbors chatted on their porches, cars drove by on their way to work. Everything looked the same as it always had, but knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The first knock on her door came at 8 in the morning. It was a reporter from the regional newspaper, a man named David who had driven 2 hours after hearing about what had happened at the talent show. He wanted to do a full feature story on, complete with photographs and interviews. Still in her robe and completely unprepared for media attention, didn't know what to say. She invited him in because she didn't know what else to do. David was kind and patient. He asked her about her childhood, her grandmother, her years of working as a cleaning lady. He asked about and how their friendship had developed. He asked how it felt to finally share her gift with the world after so many years of keeping it hidden. Answered his questions as honestly as she could, though she still felt like she was talking about someone else's life. Before he left, David took several photographs of in her small cottage. He photographed her beside the old record player next to her grandmother's pictures and holding the talent show trophy. He told her that this story would resonate with people far beyond. Everyone, he said, has a hidden gift. Everyone has been underestimated at some point. Her story was universal. The newspaper article was published 3 days later, and it changed everything once again. The story was picked up by larger outlets, shared on social media, and discussed on local radio shows. The headline read something about an invisible woman with an unforgettable voice. Within a week, his name was known throughout the state. Letters began arriving at her cottage by the bagful. They came from all over the country, from people who had read her story and been inspired by it. A woman in California wrote that courage had given her the strength to pursue her own abandoned dreams of painting. A man in Texas said he had cried reading about her because he too had hidden his talents out of fear. Teenagers wrote saying they would never judge anyone by appearances again. The letters piled up on his kitchen table, each one a testament to the impact of her story. Requests for performances started coming in. Local venues wanted her to sing at their events. Churches invited her to perform at services. Charity organizations asked if she would help with fundraisers. Schools wanted her to speak to students about believing in themselves. Who had spent her entire adult life avoiding attention was suddenly in high demand. She didn't know how to handle any of it. She turned to for guidance as she had grown accustomed to doing. They sat together in his room at the retirement home, surrounded by photographs of his own performing days, and discussed what should do. Told her to be selective, to choose opportunities that felt right, and to never lose sight of why she sang in the first place. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about sharing a gift that was meant to be shared. Took's advice to heart. She accepted some invitations and declined others. She sang at a benefit concert for the local hospital, helping raise more money than any previous event. She performed at a school assembly, bringing tears to the eyes of teachers and students alike. She visited the retirement home and sang for the elderly residents, many of whom were moved beyond words. With each performance, grew more confident. The terrified woman who had trembled on the community center stage began to transform into someone who could command a room with her presence. She learned to engage with audiences, to tell stories between songs, to connect with people in ways she had never imagined possible. The voice had always been there. Now she was learning how to use it fully. The money began coming in as well. Performance fees, donations from admirers, and small grants from arts organizations started to add up. For the first time in her life, wasn't struggling to pay her bills. She could afford to fix the leaky roof on her cottage, to buy new clothes, to donate to causes she cared about. The financial security was a welcome change, but it wasn't what mattered most to her. What mattered was the way people looked at her now. When she walked through town, people smiled and waved. They stopped to chat, asking about her next performance, telling her how much her singing meant to them. Children who had once made fun of her shuffling walk now ran up to her asking for autographs. The transformation was complete and profound. The invisible cleaning lady had become his most beloved celebrity, but never forgot where she came from. She continued to clean the community center on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, refusing to abandon the job that had sustained her for so long. The management tried to tell her she didn't need to work anymore, but she insisted. Cleaning, she said, kept her humble. It reminded her that she was still the same person she had always been, just with more people paying attention now. One afternoon, about 2 months after the talent show, received a phone call that would take her story to an entirely new level. It was from a producer at a national television network. They had heard about her and wanted to feature her on a popular talent competition show. Millions of people would see her perform. It could be the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her life. His first instinct was to refuse. The thought of performing on national television in front of millions of strangers was terrifying beyond measure. The talent show had been one thing, a room full of neighbors she knew, but this was something else entirely. This was stepping into a world she had never imagined entering. She talked to about it that evening, listened carefully, then asked a simple question. Was she refusing because she truly didn't want to do it or because she was afraid? Thought about it for a long time before answering. It was fear, she admitted. She was afraid of failing on such a big stage. She was afraid of returning to being a joke, a novelty act people laughed at. Took her hand and reminded her of something. Fear had kept invisible for decades. Fear had made her hide her gift from the world. If she let fear win now, she would be taking a step backward instead of forward. This opportunity wasn't just about anymore. It was about everyone who had written her letters, everyone who had found hope in her story. She owed it to them to keep pushing forward. Thought about's words all night. She thought about her grandmother who had dreamed of performing on grand stages. She thought about all the people who believed in her now. And she thought about the woman she had been just a few months ago, invisible and alone, singing only within the walls of her tiny cottage. That woman would never have imagined reaching this moment. But this new, the one who had found her courage, could not let fear win. The next morning, she called the producer back and accepted the invitation. She would go on national television. She would sing for millions of people. Whatever happened, she would not let fear control her life ever again. The weeks leading up to the television appearance were the most intense of life. A production team came to film background footage and conduct preliminary interviews. They captured images of her small cottage, the community center where she had worked and performed, and the streets of the town that had once dismissed her. They interviewed Mayor Wilson and dozens of townspeople, piecing together the story of the invisible woman who had found her voice. Was assigned a coach to help her prepare for the national stage. His name was Michael, a veteran vocal instructor who had worked with some of the biggest names in the music industry. He flew to and spent hours each day with, refining her technique and helping her choose the perfect song for her television debut. He was impressed by her natural talent, but he also pushed her harder than ever had. The preparation was exhausting, practiced for 6 hours a day, sometimes more. She worked on breath control, vocal projection, stage presence, and emotional delivery. She learned how to use a microphone properly, how to move on a large stage, how to connect with an audience she couldn't see because of the bright lights. Every aspect of performing was analyzed and improved. But Michael also helped her deal with the psychological aspects of performing on such a massive platform. He taught her visualization techniques, relaxation exercises, and ways to manage stage fright. He shared stories of famous performers who had struggled with anxiety and how they had overcome it. Most importantly, he constantly reminded her that she had something special, something that couldn't be taught or manufactured. Her voice came from a place of genuine emotion and experience, and that authenticity was her greatest asset. As the day of the television appearance approached, the media attention intensified. News crews from across the country came to cover the story. His face appeared on morning talk shows and in national newspapers. Social media was buzzing with her story, with millions of people sharing the video from the talent show and expressing amazement at her voice. She had become a sensation before even stepping onto the national stage. The townspeople of around her like never before. A group of volunteers organized a viewing party at the community center for the night of the broadcast. Local businesses donated decorations and refreshments. A giant screen was set up so everyone could watch together. The town that had once mocked her was now her biggest fan club, eager to support her on this incredible journey. The day before she was scheduled to fly to New York for the tapping, visited at the retirement home. His health had been declining in recent weeks, and she was now mostly confined to her bed. But her eyes still sparkled with the same fire they had always held, and her grip was still strong when she took his hand. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, shared more stories from her performing days, tales of triumphs and failures, of dreams achieved and opportunities missed. She told that a career in music was never easy, but that the joy of sharing your gift with the world made every struggle worthwhile. She made promise to stay true to herself no matter how famous she became. Before left gave her something precious. It was an old photograph from performing days, showing her on stage at a famous jazz club in New York City. On the back, had written a message that would carry with her forever. The message read that fear was just a door, and that had already opened it. All she had to do now was walk through. The flight to New York was surreal for her. She had never been on an airplane before, had never been anywhere outside the small region where she had lived her entire life. She sat by the window, watching the clouds roll by, feeling like she was traveling to another planet. The production assistant assigned to escort her noticed her nervousness and did his best to make her comfortable, explaining what to expect over the next few days. The television studio was unlike anything had ever seen. It was a massive complex filled with bustling people, flashing lights, and high-tech equipment. She was taken to a dressing room that was larger than her entire cottage, filled with flowers and gifts from well-wishers. A team of makeup artists and stylists transformed her appearance, though she insisted on keeping silver songbird brooch pinned over her heart. The rehearsals were intensive, practiced on the actual stage where she would perform, getting used to the lights, the cameras, and the vast empty space where the audience would sit. The technical crew ran through every detail of her performance, from the lighting cues to the camera angles. Everything had to be perfect for the live broadcast. The night before the show, couldn't sleep. She lay in her hotel room, more luxurious than anywhere she had ever stayed, and thought about how far she had come. Just a few months ago, she had been scrubbing floors and wondering if anyone would ever truly see her. Now she was about to sing for millions of people. The journey seemed impossible, yet here she was. She thought about all the people who were counting on her, watching from her room at the retirement home. The townspeople of gathered at the community center. All the strangers who had written letters saying her story had inspired them. The weight of their expectations was enormous, but it was also strangely comforting. She wasn't alone in this. She had never been alone, she realized. She had just never known how many people were waiting to support her. The morning of the show arrived gray and rainy, but felt a strange calm. She went through her preparations methodically, ate a light breakfast, did her vocal exercises, and allowed the stylists to work their magic once again. The hours passed slowly, each minute bringing her closer to the moment that would define her new life. By early evening, the studio audience had filled every seat. These were people who had applied for tickets months in advance, excited to see the show's various performers. Some of them knew story, having seen the viral videos and news coverage. Others had no idea who she was. They would all know soon enough. Backstage waited in the wings, watching other performers take their turns. There were singers, dancers, comedians, and acrobats, each one talented and polished. The competition was fierce and felt a flutter of doubt. These were professionals who had been performing for years. She was just a cleaning lady who had discovered her voice late in life. What was she doing here? But then she touched the songbird brooch and felt strength flowing into her. She remembered her grandmother's words about having a gift meant to be shared. She thought about all the years she had kept that gift hidden, and all the joy she had missed because of fear. Not anymore. Tonight, she would show the world who she really was. The host's voice echoed through the studio, introducing her with a brief summary of her story. The audience murmured with interest, some leaning forward in anticipation. A few whispers and giggles could be heard, reminders that not everyone believed the hype. Some people still expected her to fail. The stage manager gave her the signal, took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked into the spotlight. The cameras were rolling. Millions of people were watching. And Ellen, who had spent her whole life invisible, was about to become unforgettable. The stage lights were even brighter than they had been during rehearsals. Walked to the center mark, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the microphone would pick it up. She could barely make out the audience through the glare, but she could sense their presence, hundreds of eyes watching, millions more through the cameras that circled her like curious birds. The host, a famous entertainer whose face had seen on television for years, approached her with his trademark smile. He asked her a few questions about her journey, about the talent show, about how it felt to go from cleaning floors to standing on the stage. answered as best she could, her voice steady despite her nerves. The audience laughed warmly at her honest, humble responses. They were already beginning to root for her. Then came the moment. The host stepped aside, the music began, and was alone in the spotlight. She had chosen a different song for this performance, one that told the story of her own life even more directly than the aria she had sung at the talent show. It was about a woman who had been invisible, who had hidden her true self from the world, who had finally found the courage to step into the light. The first notes left her lips and the studio fell silent. Just like at the talent show, there was that immediate recognition that something extraordinary was happening. But this time, the reaction was by the size of the stage, the quality of the sound system, and the millions of people watching at home. The viewing party at the community center erupted in cheers as Face appeared on the giant screen. People hugged each other, cried, and sat in stunned silence as her voice filled the room. Mayor Wilson stood at the front, wiping his eyes and shaking his head in disbelief. This woman had cleaned his office for 15 years, and he had never known, never suspected, what she was capable of. At the retirement home, watched on a small television in her room, surrounded by nurses and staff who had gathered to share the moment. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face as she listened to the voice she had discovered and nurtured. Her student, her friend, was showing the world what she had always known. The songbird was finally soaring. His voice built in intensity as the song progressed. She poured every emotion into the performance, drawing on all the pain and hope and longing of her life. The years of invisibility, the cruel mockery, the secret singing in her cottage, the terrifying decision to sign up for the talent show, everything came together in a performance that transcended mere entertainment and became something approaching art. The studio audience was spellbound. Judges on their panel sat with their mouths open, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Cameras zoomed in on faces wet with tears, on hands clutched to hearts, on people embracing strangers beside them, united in a shared emotional experience. This was what live performance was supposed to be, a connection between artist and audience that touched something deep and universal. When reached the climax of the song, her voice soaring to heights that seemed almost superhuman, the audience could contain themselves no longer. They began to rise, one by one, then in groups, until the entire studio was on its feet. The standing ovation began before the song was even finished, a rare and remarkable response that the production team would later say they had never seen before. Finished the final note and stood in the spotlight, chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. The applause was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to go on forever. The judges were on their feet too, clapping and cheering with the crowd. The host had abandoned his professional composure and was wiping his eyes openly. When the noise finally died down enough for anyone to speak, the head judge, a legendary music producer known for his harsh criticism, took the microphone. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. He had been in the music industry for 40 years, he said. He had discovered stars and shaped careers. He thought he had seen everything. But nothing had ever moved him like what he had just witnessed. He called his performance the most authentic, most powerful thing he had ever seen on any stage. The other judges followed with similar praise. They spoke of her voice, of course, which was extraordinary beyond measure, but they also spoke of her story, her courage, her authenticity. In an industry often criticized for being fake and manufactured, was refreshingly, powerfully real. One judge told her that she had reminded everyone watching why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. The host returned to his side, still visibly shaken by what he had witnessed. He asked her how she felt, and she could barely answer through her tears. She spoke about her grandmother, about all the years she had kept her gift hidden. She thanked the people for eventually believing in her, and she thanked everyone watching for giving her this chance. It was a raw, honest moment that only made the audience love her more. That night became a national sensation. Her performance was the most watched segment of the show's entire season. Clips were shared millions of times on social media. News networks interrupted their coverage to discuss what had just happened. Celebrities tweeted about being moved to tears. The cleaning lady from nowhere had become the most talked-about person in the country. The aftermath was overwhelming. Record companies called with offers. Talk shows requested appearances. Invitations to perform at prestigious venues flooded in from around the world. Still in her hotel room, surrounded by her small team, couldn't process what was happening. In the span of one evening, her life had changed more dramatically than she had ever thought possible. But even in the midst of this whirlwind, thoughts kept returning to. She wanted to see, to thank her properly for everything. She wanted to walk the streets of her and feel the connection to the place that had shaped her. The bright lights of television were dazzling, but home was still home. She flew back to the next morning, exhausted but exhilarated. The town had organized a welcome party, and hundreds of people lined the streets to greet her when she arrived. There were banners with her name, children waving signs, and so much love and support that felt she might burst from happiness. The woman who had once been invisible was now the center of attention, and for once, she didn't mind at all. Her first stop was the retirement home, was waiting for her, propped up in bed, looking frailer than had ever seen her. But her smile was as warm as ever, and her eyes still held that familiar spark. They embraced for a long time, neither needing to say anything. The moment spoke for itself. Told her how proud she was, how watching the performance had been the highlight of her long life. She joked that she could die happy now, having seen her student achieve greatness. Begged her not to talk like that, but they both knew that health was failing. The time they had together was precious, and they both wanted to make the most of it. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Fielded calls and meetings, trying to navigate the sudden fame that had engulfed her. But she made sure to spend time with every day, singing for her, reading to her, simply sitting together in comfortable silence. These moments were more valuable than any television appearance or recording contract. The world was waiting for but knew what truly mattered. Fame was wonderful, but love was better. Success was gratifying, but connection was essential. As she sat beside bed, holding her mentor's hand, she understood that everything she had achieved was built on the foundation of this relationship. Without, none of it would have been possible. 3 weeks after his triumphant television appearance, Williams passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 92 years old and had lived a life full of music, love, and purpose. Her final act of greatness had been discovering and nurturing the talent of a woman everyone else had overlooked. She died knowing that her work was complete. Was devastated. Despite knowing that health had been failing, the loss hit her like a physical blow. She canceled all her upcoming appearances and retreated to her cottage, grieving the woman who had changed her life. The world would have to wait. Right now, she needed to mourn. The funeral was held at the community center, the same venue where had first stepped into the spotlight. It was filled to capacity with people who had known and loved, as well as others who had never met her but wanted to pay their respects. The service was simple and beautiful, featuring music from the jazz era and heartfelt tributes from those whose lives she had touched. Had been asked to sing at the funeral, and she agreed despite her grief. She stood before the congregation, silver songbird brooch pinned to her black dress, and sang a beautiful jazz standard that had been his favorite. Her voice was thick with emotion, cracking at moments, but somehow that only made it more powerful. Everyone in attendance wept openly, united in their sorrow and their appreciation for the remarkable woman they had lost. After the service, received an envelope from his lawyer. It contained a letter that had written shortly before her death, intended to be delivered after she was gone. Opened it with trembling hands and read the words through a veil of tears. Wrote that meeting had been one of the greatest gifts of her life. She explained that when she first heard about the cleaning lady signing up for the talent show, something had told her to get involved. She had followed her instinct, and what she discovered had renewed her faith in the power of music and the resilience of the human spirit. She wrote that had taught her just as much as she had taught. The letter continued with practical advice about navigating the music industry, warnings about people who might try to take advantage of her, and encouragement to always stay true to herself. Wrote that the world would try to change her, to polish away her rough edges and turn her into something artificial. She begged to resist, to always remember the woman who had sung alone in her cottage, to never lose the authenticity that made her special. At the end of the letter made a final request. She asked to use her platform to help other invisible people find their voices. The world was full of hidden talents, she wrote, people with gifts they were too afraid or too marginalized to share. Had the power to inspire them, to show them that it was never too late to step into the light. This, wrote, was her legacy. This was what she hoped would carry forward. Read the letter many times over the following days, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. She kept it in a special box alongside her grandmother's photographs and other treasures. It became a guide for her new life, a reminder of what truly mattered amid all the noise and attention. As the weeks passed, slowly emerged from her grief. She began accepting engagements again, carefully selecting opportunities that aligned with vision. She signed a recording contract with a respected label that promised to preserve her artistic integrity. She performed at charity events raising money for causes she believed in, and she began speaking publicly about the importance of believing in yourself even when others don't. Her message resonated with people around the world. Letters continued to pour in, now from people who had heard her speak about overcoming invisibility and found the courage to pursue their own dreams. A retired nurse wrote that she had finally started the bakery she had always dreamed of. A teenager said he had joined the school theater club despite being bullied for years. A woman in her 60s had enrolled in art classes for the first time. Each letter was proof that Story was making a difference. True to his request, began actively seeking out hidden talents. She established a foundation in its name that provided grants and mentorship to undiscovered artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. She visited schools, community centers, and retirement homes, encouraging people to share their gifts regardless of age or circumstance. She became not just a performer, but a champion for the overlooked and underestimated. Her first album was released to critical acclaim. It featured a mix of classical arias, jazz standards, and contemporary songs, all showcasing the remarkable range and emotional depth of her voice. The album debuted at the top of the charts and remained there for weeks. Critics praised not just her technical skill, but the authenticity and emotion she brought to every track. It was, they said, the sound of a life fully lived finally being expressed. Toured the country, performing in venues that ranged from intimate theaters to grand concert halls. Each show was a celebration of her journey, from the small cottage where she had sung alone to the massive stages where thousands now gathered to hear her. She always dedicated at least one song too, keeping her mentor's memory alive with every performance. Along the way, she remained connected too. She kept her cottage, returning whenever her schedule allowed. She continued to visit the community center, though now she performed there rather than cleaned. The town that had once dismissed her had become one of her most fervent supporters, proud to claim her as their own. A bronze statue was even proposed for the town square, though modestly declined, saying she hadn't done anything worthy of being immortalized in metal. Her fame brought unexpected opportunities and challenges. She was invited to perform at prestigious events around the world, from state dinners to international festivals. She received honors and awards that she had never imagined receiving, but she also faced criticism and jealousy from those who resented her success or questioned her story. Some accused her of being manufactured, of having professional training she was hiding, of being a fraud. These accusations stung but had developed thick skin during her years of being mocked. She knew the truth, and that was enough. One of the most meaningful experiences of her new life was meeting other performers who had followed similar paths. She connected with artists who had been discovered late in life, who had overcome obstacles to share their gifts, who understood what it meant to be underestimated and dismissed. These connections formed a network of support and encouragement, a community of people who had proven that it was never too late to pursue your dreams. Also reconnected with parts of her own past that she had long forgotten. Distant relatives who had lost touch reached out after seeing her on television. Old schoolmates who remembered her as a quiet, shy girl expressed amazement at what she had become. Even people who had known her grandmother contacted her, sharing stories and memories that enriched her understanding of the woman who had first recognized her gift. Through it all, never forgot the lesson she had learned. She remained humble despite her success, kind despite having been treated with cruelty, and authentic despite the pressures of fame. She wore silver songbird brooch at every performance, a constant reminder of the woman who had believed in her when no one else did. And she sang with the same passion and emotion that had characterized her very first public performance, the night she had transformed from laughingstock to legend. The Invisible Woman had become one of the most visible and beloved performers in the world. But in her heart, she was still just a woman with a gift and a story, doing her best to share both with a world that needed inspiration. 5 years had passed since the night first stepped onto the stage at the Spring Talent Show. In that time, her life had transformed beyond anything she could have imagined when she was scrubbing floors and singing alone in her cottage. She had released 3 successful albums, performed in concert halls across 5 continents, and received numerous awards and honors. But as remarkable as her professional achievements were, they paled in comparison to the personal growth she had experienced. Was now 52 years old, though she felt younger than she had at 47. The years of hiding had aged her spirit, but stepping into the light had reversed that process. She stood taller now, spoke with confidence, and smiled easily and often. The Invisible Woman had become someone who commanded attention and respect wherever she went. Yet she never forgot where she had come from or the woman she had once been. The Williams Foundation had grown beyond expectations. It had helped hundreds of aspiring artists discover and develop their talents, providing scholarships, mentorship, and performance opportunities. Many of its beneficiaries had gone on to successful careers, and each success story added to its legacy. The foundation had also established programs in schools and community centers, reaching young people before they had the chance to become invisible like had been. Returned to as often as she could. The town had changed in subtle ways since her rise to fame. Tourism had increased, with people wanting to see where the remarkable singing cleaning lady had lived. A small museum had opened, celebrating her journey and displaying photographs and memorabilia from her early days. The community center now bore its name, a tribute to the woman who had made everything possible. The anniversary of the talent show that had changed everything was always a special occasion. Each year, returned to perform at the community center, keeping the tradition alive and reminding herself of her roots. The shows were always sold out, with proceeds going to the foundation. People came from across the country to attend, eager to be part of the continuing story. On the 5th anniversary, planned something special. She had been working on a documentary about her journey, and the premiere would coincide with her anniversary performance. The documentary featured interviews with everyone who had played a role in her story, from the neighbors who had mocked her to the producers who had discovered her. It was an honest, moving account of what it meant to overcome invisibility and find your voice. The premiere was held at the community center, now officially named the Williams Community Center. A large crowd gathered for the screening, including celebrities who had become friends, journalists covering the event, and townspeople who had known since before she was famous. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The documentary opened with footage of the cleaning lady with the bowed head and shuffling walk. Viewers saw interviews with people who admitted to having mocked her, their faces contorted with shame and regret. They saw the sign-up sheet for the talent show, with its name written in trembling letters. They saw the preparations, the doubt, the fear. Then came the performance. Even though everyone in the room had seen it before, the effect was still powerful. The initial laughter, the stunned silence, the building applause, the standing ovation, it all played out on screen in vivid detail. Many in the audience wept openly, transported back to that transformative night 5 years ago. The documentary continued Thru's journey, chronicling her television appearance, the death of, the establishment of the foundation, and her rise to international fame. It included interviews with people whose lives had been changed by her story, invisible people who had found their voices because of her example. The message was clear and powerful. Everyone has a gift. Everyone deserves to be seen. It is never too late to share your light with the world. When the credits rolled, the audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Stood at the front of the room, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the response. She thanked everyone for being part of her journey, for believing in her, for proving that transformation was possible at any age and against any odds. After the screening, took the stage for her anniversary performance. The community center was the same room where she had first revealed her gift, but it felt different now. The walls were lined with photographs of foundation beneficiaries. His portrait hung prominently near the entrance. The space was filled with love and history and the unmistakable sense that something magical had begun here. Sang many songs that night, each one a marker of her journey. She performed the aria that had first stunned the townspeople. She sang the song from her television debut. She performed jazz standards in tribute to and new songs from her latest album. Each performance was met with thunderous applause and genuine emotion from the audience. For her final song, chose something different. It was a simple lullaby that her grandmother had sung to her as a child, the very first song she had ever learned. She had never performed it publicly before, saving it for this special moment. As she sang, she thought about her grandmother, about everyone who had believed in her and helped her along the way. She thought about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She thought about all the invisible people still waiting to be seen. When the song ended, the silence was profound. Then slowly the applause began, building to a crescendo that shook the walls. Stood in the center of the stage, the same spot where she had stood 5 years ago as a laughingstock and felt complete peace. She had done it. She had honored her gift, fulfilled her grandmother's dreams, carried forward's legacy, and inspired countless others to step into their own light. As the audience filed out into the warm spring night, many stopped to embrace and thank her for everything she had given them. Children asked for autographs. Former skeptics offered heartfelt apologies. Old friends and new admirers alike expressed their gratitude for her presence in their lives. Walked home alone that night just as she had walked home after the original talent show 5 years earlier. The streets were quiet, lit by in starlight. She passed the grocery store where people had once whispered about her, the post office where she had been pointed at, the corner where teenagers had mocked her. None of that seemed to matter anymore. The pain had transformed into power, the humiliation into humility, the invisibility into impact. When she reached her cottage, she stood outside for a moment, looking at the modest building that had sheltered her through so much. Inside those walls, she had sung alone for decades, nurturing a gift no one knew she had. Inside those walls, she had nearly given up on her dreams. Inside those walls had discovered her and changed everything. Went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. His letter was on the table beside her, slightly worn from countless readings. She picked it up and read the familiar words one more time, feeling her mentor's presence as clearly as if she were sitting in the room. The world saw as a star, a success story and inspiration. But in this quiet moment she was still just a woman with a gift and a purpose. Tomorrow she would return to her busy life of performances and appearances and foundation work. But tonight she was simply grateful, grateful for the journey that had brought her here, for the people who had believed in her, and for the voice that had finally been set free. She had been a laughingstock, and then she had moved everyone to tears. She had been invisible, and then she had become unforgettable. She had been afraid, and then she had found courage. Her story was proof that it is never too late to become who you were meant to be. And somewhere, beyond the veil between worlds, her grandmother and were smiling, knowing that the songbird had finally learned to soar.